Heading into the offseason, everybody said the Jets' two biggest needs were wide receiver and offensive line, and their pick at 10th overall in the NFL draft needed to be at one of those two spots. The Jets addressed both needs in free agency, but I still think the pick at 10 should either be wide receiver or offensive line. That may sound like a contradiction, but it's not, and I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, April 5th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today, we're talking about the NFL draft. Heading into the offseason, everybody said the big two needs for the Jets were offensive line and wide receiver, and everybody said that the pick at 10 better either be an offensive lineman or a wide receiver. Well, the Jets addressed both spots in free agency, and now should their draft strategy change? I say no, and I'm going to explain to you why on today's episode. Now, on the offensive line right now, I think you could say that if everybody stays healthy, and if everybody plays up to expectations, and if none of the older players decline, the Jets' offensive line could be quite good. And I'm talking well above average. I'm not just talking like a middle of the pack offensive line. This could be one of the better offensive lines in football because the Jets, have replaced whatever they had at tackle with Tyron Smith, who's one of the greatest tackles of his era. They've traded for Morgan Moses, who's a very solid right tackle guy who's just been, not a star, but the kind of guy you need to make an offensive line work. A guy who just shows up every week, a guy who never misses a snap, guy who just gives you really, really solid football. And then John Simpson, a younger player who you hope is ascending, wide variety of outcomes with Simpson, joining Joe Tippmann, who is a talented young center, and Elijah Vera Tucker, who, maybe the poster boy for if he stays healthy, is very good. He's been very good the last 2 years during the brief points where he's been on the field. So on paper, this line looks pretty good. The depth, not so much. Once you get past the starting five, depth becomes a big question mark for this team, especially at the tackle position, because at the tackle spot, you have two older players. It's probably going to be the oldest starting tackle duo in the league. Smith and Moses are both currently 33 years old. And Smith in particular has been a big injury risk. He's missed at least 3 games every year since 2015, at least 3 games. So I think, it's tough to imagine Smith's going to give you a full 17 games. I think, the upside scenario would probably be 13 to 14 games. If you get that out of him, I think you're pretty happy with what you've gotten this season. And the tackle spot, the depth, you hope Carter Warren improves. It would be nice if he did. You certainly would be happy if Carter Warren, developed into a quality backup, a guy who could get you through a couple of games. But that's certainly no guarantee. And, who else do you have? Max Mitchell? I think the Max Mitchell hopes are largely over at this point. After how little he provided you last year and, just his own physical limitations, I don't know Max Mitchell's going to give you much. So depth is important on the offensive line. Now, I don't think you would draft a tackle 10th overall simply for the sake of improving depth. You don't draft a long-term backup at 10 overall. But I think it's fair to say people who say, well, if you draft a tackle at 10th, he's not going to play this year. He's probably going to play an appreciable number of snaps with 2 tackles who are 33, one of whom is Tyron Smith, who's notorious for having injury issues, having to miss time due to injuries. I think we can say with some degree of confidence that anybody the Jets drafted 10 going to see an appreciable amount of playing time. It could be a really important player because, again, this offensive line, if you have a weakness at one tackle spot, your entire offensive line can crumble. But even though you wouldn't draft a tackle to be a long-term backup at 10th overall, it's fine if he's a backup your first year, especially in a situation like the Jets. The real reason you look to draft a tackle is looking over the horizon. And again, the Jets are all in this year. The Jets have done everything possible to focus on the short term. At some point, it's okay to think long-term. It's okay to think a little bit long-term. That's one of the benefits of, adding Smith and Moses is, in the short run, you could say that our tackle situation looks pretty solid, if these guys stay healthy. And it gives you the luxury of looking long in the long run. Same thing with signing Mike Williams at the wide receiver position. it gives you, it's not necessarily a huge deal anymore if you don't draft somebody at either spot. Heading into the offseason, Jets had one first-round pick, and they had enormous holes on both the offensive line and wide receiver group. And you enter the offseason saying, like, how are they going to address both of these? They can't address both of these through the draft. Well, they've addressed both of these through free agency, which now gives you a little bit more flexibility. It gives you the opportunity to think long-term. Because if you're in the mindset that the guy you drafted 10 has to be a star year one, and he has to be a primary player year one, well, then you take a tight end. You take Brock Bowers, because that's really the only spot where the Jets have a starting position open. And we've been over this, why that's a very risky move and why it's probably not the highest upside move the Jets can make, especially when we think about the long run. Yeah, you can be all in, but you can occasionally think about the future. And the future for the Jets on the offensive line, there's a lot of unknowns. Smith is in the final year of his contract. He's 33. Moses is in the final year of his contract. He's 33. Now, both of these guys are still playing at a pretty high level. So this is not like Dwayne Brown a year ago, where you're just praying you could somehow piece together 17 games from this guy who was clearly in decline and who had shown signs that, his body wasn't really going to be able to hold up. Smith, although he's got a pretty extensive injury history at this point, did play 13 games last year and was a second team All-Pro. So it's reasonable to think, these guys can give you a pretty high level of play this year. But what about next year? And next year, the Jets' cap situation continues to be shaky. This year, they kind of had to roll the dice on some calculated gambles, some older players that could not really go for guys in their prime because of the cap situation. The cap situation doesn't get better until you really hit the reset button. Jets aren't going to be able to do that this year. So you're dealing with another situation. You can't keep doing this stuff piecemeal. Offensive lines are based on continuity. You want to have long-term players playing together for a long time. You don't want to keep having, look, this year they had to piece it together. They didn't really have another choice because of where they were. But in the long run, you want guys that are going to play next to each other for 3, 4, 5 years. You want to think about investing in that spot, because the draft is not so much about addressing short-term needs. Some teams do it, frequently to their own detriment. But the draft is really about building for the long run, making sure your premium positions, in particular in the first round, are set up for a longer haul. And that's why I think drafting a tackle 10th overall would be a very viable move for the Jets this year. First of all, you can't say there's zero value in the short run, because whoever you drafted 10 is going to be the third tackle on a team where you have two very old tackles, and one of whom is very injury prone. So the player, whoever the third tackle is for the Jets this year, is going to be a very important player. Yeah, you hope they don't get injured, but hope's not the strategy, especially when you're dealing with the Tyron Smith. You got to make sure you have a good backup. Now, again, Tyron Smith's not David Bakhtiari. If the Jets signed David Bakhtiari, there's no chance he'd be able to stay healthy. Tyron Smith can, there's a pretty good chance he's going to be able to give you a decent number of games, play really at a really high level through much of the season. But the backup's probably going to see some time this year for the Jets. And just in general, offensive line's a spot, even if you have guys who are durable, there's a spot where a freak injury can happen at any point. But in the long run, in 2025, and again, it's okay, even when you've pushed this much to the present, it's okay to think a little bit about the future, especially with your first round pick. You want somebody, you don't want to have another offseason next year where you're entering it needing 2 tackles. You draft somebody this year, you have that one spot locked down for the future. And by the way, and I like Morgan Moses, but why is it set in stone that Morgan Moses has to be a starter? 3 years ago, when he played well for the Jets, he began the season in the backup and only got into the starting lineup because Mekhi Becton got injured. If you draft a guy 10 overall, probably a blue chip prospect, probably a guy who can push Moses for the starting right tackle job. And then Moses becomes the super sub. He becomes like the super backup. So that's another thing to consider. Offensive line depth's never a bad idea, but more importantly, having some stability at the tackle in the long run is still a critical thing. The Jets had short-term and long-term needs of tackle entering the offseason. They've addressed the short-term. The draft is where you address the long-term. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the wide receiver position because it's another spot where you can make a pretty strong case. Jets could use an investment in a young player there. We'll talk about that in more detail continuing this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, Your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need for the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes Monday through Friday and then bonus episodes as news breaks. Today we're talking about the NFL draft, keeping an eye towards that. Free agency kind of winding down. I mean, there are going to be players who will be signed in the weeks and months ahead. We'll probably get into like June, July, and there'll still might be a recognizable name or two who's still on the market. But for the most part, attention is turned to the NFL draft. And things in some ways have changed since we began the offseason. You always begin the offseason saying, these are our needs. And sometimes your draft strategy changes as a result of the players you sign. And for the Jets, their two biggest needs on paper have been addressed. The offensive line looks much better on paper than it did at the start of the offseason. And wide receiver, it looks better. I mean, I don't want to say it looks much better because really the difference is one player, and that's Mike Williams, who the Jets signed. And it was a good signing. I remember like the days before he signed, I remember talking on the podcast about how Jets better sign Mike Williams because he's a good fit and he's like the last good fit available. Well, they got him. He is coming off an injury though. He's 30 years old. A lot of the stuff I just said about offensive line also applies to the wide receiver position. And you want to give Aaron Rodgers as many quality targets as possible. And one of the things is you can't address both offensive line and wide receiver in the first round. And by the time you get to the third round, I mean, you could talk about prospects. There are going to be a lot of good prospects available, guys who could potentially be quality players, quality starters, quality role players. But if you look across the NFL in a typical year, there aren't a lot of third-round picks who make an immediate impact. It happens. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it happens far less than you think. And it's almost like if you get a day one impact player in the third round, you're lucky. Now, if you get a long-term impact player, you're good at drafting. If you find somebody who's ready to step in right away, you're kind of lucky because the guys who are ready to step in typically go round one, round two. And if somebody falls to round three, it means he kind of slipped through the cracks. And the league may have missed out on somebody. So really, you can only address one of these two spots in a meaningful way, at least in the short run, in the NFL draft. And as we mentioned, offensive line's a guy. If you draft somebody, he's going to play a pretty significant role anyway in year one. At the wide receiver position, I think more than anything, in the short run, you're looking for insurance because Mike Williams is coming off a serious injury. I do think Mike Williams' injury history is overstated. He usually doesn't miss that much time. Recovering from an ACL, there's some degree of risk in that, but plenty of players have come back and been successful. The other thing you have to remember is that the Jets don't necessarily need Mike Williams to be their number one wide receiver. He's a guy who fits perfectly for what the Jets need, because what do the Jets need? I think what the Jets need is more a question of what does Garrett Wilson not do well? Garrett Wilson struggles against some of the bigger, more physical corners who press him at the line of scrimmage. So Mike Williams can play the X spot in those situations. And the X spot is essentially there's one wide receiver who lines up at the line of scrimmage on each snap. And that's known as the X receiver. And everybody else, the other two receivers, and it depends on your formation. Sometimes you have two guys lined up at the line of scrimmage, but in a typical formation, you are required by rule to have 7 guys line up on the line of scrimmage. 5 of them are usually your offensive linemen. In fact, 5 of them are always your offensive linemen. 1 is usually your tight end, and then there's 1 wide receiver. And that guy's easier to run press coverage against, where you get physical against them, where you kind of shove them around. The other wide receivers can line up a yard or two behind the line of scrimmage, and that makes them tougher to press because you're not lined up right across from them as a corner. So Garrett struggles with the physical press coverages. So against the more physical teams, the Jets can play Mike Williams at the X. What else does Garrett struggle with? He struggles with contested catches. I see people all the time say Garrett needs to improve this. It's not Garrett's game. I don't think it's ever going to be Garrett's game. What Garrett Wilson does, he runs routes really well. He creates separation really well. He's not a big, strong guy. Mike Williams is. Mike Williams can win contested catches. He's going to be, I think if he's healthy, if he plays up to potential, he'll be very good on the intermediate routes. He's also been a good deep threat through his career, and Garrett's got the speed to do it. And I don't know how much of this might just be the Jets could not throw deep last year because they could not pass protect. But Mike Williams is a good deep threat. Garrett's been, I think Garrett actually has potential to be a good deep threat, but hasn't been there yet. But you're depending on a guy in Mike Williams who, again, coming off an injury, and I'm optimistic about Mike Williams. I just think, you need to understand, you need to explore all possibilities. There is a possibility. I'm not expecting it, that Mike Williams, something happens with the injury, he gets hurt again. you want to have some insurance, because if Mike Williams goes down, you're right back to that receiver group you had in 2023. Now, with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, you can expect more production with what should be an improved offensive line. You should expect Rodgers to be able to do well with a patchwork group of receivers, but you don't want to have a patchwork group of receivers, especially with Rodgers at 40, especially with Rodgers coming off an injury. You want to help Aaron Rodgers out as much as you can. And the Jets are almost a perfect situation to bring in a blue chip receiver prospect, because that guy's they're not going to count on that guy for a whole lot right off the bat. He's not going to have to do anything. There's a difference between if the guy steps up and shows he belongs, then yeah, he can really carve out a role for this team, but he doesn't need to. Anybody they draft is probably going to be in the starting lineup at the wide receiver position. They'll start off as the third wide receiver. Well, your third wide receiver is not that critical a part of your passing game. But if that guy goes out there and shows he belongs and proves he outplays Mike Williams, he could easily slide into the second slot, and then Mike Williams becomes a really overqualified third option. The long run, we're dealing with a lot of the same concepts we're talking about on the offensive line. Now, at tackle, you have nothing going forward. That's one of the reasons it's important to draft a tackle. And that's one of the reasons I probably lean more towards tackle than wide receiver. At wide receiver, you at least have one very good young player in Garrett Wilson, a guy who hopefully, if the Jets have any sense in them, will lock him up to a long-term extension after the season when he's first eligible. You have to be 3 years into the NFL before you're eligible to sign a contract extension. If the Jets have any sense, they'll re-sign him and lock him up long-term after the season, unless something unexpected happens this year. But after that, though, there's not a whole lot. I mean, you're dealing with some guys who are undrafted, Xavier Gibson, Jason Brownlee, where the realistic hope for them is probably more along the lines that they develop into decent backups who maybe can get you through a game or two or something like that. You're not talking about guys who you're really focused on being an integral part of your future. So you add a second guy with Garrett Wilson, suddenly, the next 5 to 7 years, you got a dynamic 1-2 punch. Now, the caveat here, and another part of the reason I kind of lean towards offensive line is there's a big 3 receiver group in this year's class. You have Marvin Harrison Jr., you have Rome Odunze, and Malik Neighbors. And those guys are all projected to be gone by 10. Whereas the tackle position, at least as things currently stand, look, these things can change rapidly. Typically the week before the draft, there's a lot of movement. But as things stand right now, there's a very good chance Joe Alt's the only tackle off the board. And I'd probably lean towards tackle 2, whether it's Fuaga or Fashanu, over wide receiver 4 in this year's class. But if one of those guys falls, if one of those 3 guys falls, I think any of them would be a very good pick for the New York Jets, because it would help secure the future. And look, you want dynamic playmakers. You want as many dynamic playmakers as possible. You have two guys you drafted 2 years ago in Breece Hall and Garrett, but you want to add to that. You don't want to put an upper limit on the number of playmakers you have or the number of playmakers you need. Every team needs more playmakers. That's what the modern NFL is showing us. So I think wide receiver, again, would remain a spot that makes sense for the Jets. It's another long-term need. You talk about some of the other spots that are key for the Jets. They're not necessarily big long-term needs. The spots that I just mentioned, tackle and wide receiver, in the short run, the Jets have done a good job filling them, but in the long run, they need more help at those spots. Those spots are not secure for the future. Now, if you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, well, look at a third alternative. Could Jets potentially trade up or trade down? I have some thoughts on that. I'm very in favor of one, not so much in favor of the other. I'll explain why as we continue this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Robinhood Retirement. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood is the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA, available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Friday, we're talking about the upcoming NFL draft, just a couple of weeks away. Free agency, for the most part, winding down. There will still be some signings that will happen in the days, weeks, and months ahead, but all eyes are starting to focus now on the NFL draft. Jets own the 10th overall pick. We've talked about some of their options with this pick in the first couple of segments, but of course, there's no guarantee the Jets will keep this pick. And there are all kinds of rumors flying around, as there always are this time of year. Will the Jets look to trade up? Will the Jets look to trade down? The argument for trading up is, as always, is you can land what are projected to be the premium prospects by moving up from 10, trading down. Maybe you don't get a guy who's rated as highly, but you can still get a very good player, and you add extra picks. So if the Jets don't stay at 10, which of the two should they do? And the question as always depends. The answer to the question as always depends on what the deals are that are offered. If somebody offered the Jets to move up to 5 and all they had to give up were, 2 of their 7th round picks, of course you'd do it. And if the Jets were to trade down from 10 to 20 and all they were offered was a 6th round pick, it would be difficult to justify that. So with the caveat that we're always talking about market value, and there are always exceptions to every rule. Generally speaking, I would be very hesitant to see the Jets look to trade up. This is a team that's already short on draft capital, and I know it's not exciting to think about, but good team building are moves that don't excite people a ton at the time, but they're the product of good scouting, good player development. You find somebody who you think fits your system, and the coaches get to work developing them. And the Jets have not done a great job at that, to say the least, over the last decade plus. But if they want to get better at this, that's what has to happen. If the Jets trade down from 10 and they add a 2nd round pick, I've heard people say, well, the Jets have been awful in the 2nd round. Why would they want a 2nd round pick? Well, don't you think there's a connection between how little success the Jets have had and how poorly they've drafted in the 2nd round? The lesson from the Jets failing in the 2nd round is not that 2nd round picks should be thrown out the window. The lesson is that the Jets really need to start hitting on these 2nd round picks. And this year, the Jets don't have a 2nd round pick. Last year, they did not have a 3rd round pick because of the Hassan Reddick trade. They're either going to be missing a 2 or a 3 in 2026. So this means that Jets are going to be short on picks. And if you trade down, you can make that up. You can get back some of the picks that you traded away. How about trading up? Well, I always give you numbers. I always give you statistics on these things. And it's true. I mean, the difference between picking 10th and picking 18th in the NFL, really not that big. Yeah, I'd rather pick 10th over 18th if you gave me the choice of two, but the expected outcome's not that different. So if you trade down even as far as 18, you're not really hurting your chances of getting a really good player in this draft, and you're potentially adding a 2nd round pick. But let me just ask you this, because I think this is kind of common sense. Do you think the only way a team in this year's NFL draft can get a premium player is picking in the top 9? Do you really think there are only 9 players who are going to be really good players in this year's draft? Or would it be a heck of a terrible draft class? And this is not viewed as a heck of a terrible draft class. Viewed as a very deep draft class. Last year was viewed as a terrible draft class. And even then, I don't think anybody would say if you were at pick 11, you were doomed. So why do we act like this? It feels like every year we act like there are only like 5 great players in this year's draft class. If you can't get a great player at 10, I don't know what you're doing. Again, exceptions apply. I think there are 2 players I'd be okay with the Jets trading up for, and I don't love the idea because frequently teams overestimate their ability to scout talent when they trade up. They think this guy's a premium player. This is the only guy who's going to be great in the draft. They make the same mistake we just discussed. These NFL teams do this. They act like we can't get a great player unless we're at 10, unless we're picking higher than 10. Now, if they were to get Marvin Harrison Jr., I don't love the idea of trading up because again, you're giving up picks that you need. The Jets, especially a team that's more going to be older this year, a team that really hasn't thought that much about their future, a team that's done pretty much everything they could in their power to maximize this year at the expense of the future. At some point, it's okay to think once or twice about your future. And, I understand you'd be trading up for a guy who you'd expect to be a premium player, but you're giving up extra picks in return. And again, can't you get a great player at 10? Can't you get a great player at 15 or 20? You should be able to. Marvin Harrison Jr. is such a good prospect, though, that I feel like you could probably justify it. The guy who I think you really justify a trade up for would be Joe Alt, the tackle out of Notre Dame, a guy who looks as plug and play as any player in this class, a guy who could really lock down your tackle position for the next decade. I mean, essentially, if you traded up for Alt, that's the one guy I'm pretty certain would send Morgan Moses to the bench. Alt would play right tackle, and then when Tyron Smith got injured, he'd slide over to the left tackle, and Moses would come in to play right tackle. And then a year down the line, Alt would take over for Smith when Smith departs for greener pastures or retirement. Alt is such a lock to. I don't want to say a lock because no player's ever a lock. How many can't miss guys have missed, but the odds of Alt being a really good player, I think, are really high at a position where it's not easy to find players. Even Marvin Harrison Jr., like, I guess you could justify it because he's such a good prospect, but there still should be good receivers available, and you don't necessarily need the greatest. Is Garrett Wilson a top 10 receiver in the league? No. Is he a top 15? You could argue either way. And he's still really, really good. He's still worth it. He still makes a big impact for the Jets. So I would hesitate to see the Jets move up, even for a receiver. I guess I could talk myself into it for Marvin Harrison Jr., but I think really the Jets should be more focused. If they're going to look to get out of the pick, is to trade down, recoup some of the draft capital that they've lost, and really start thinking of the future, adding these extra building blocks. Again, you could say, well, Jets may miss in the second round. Well, of course that's true, but the best drafting teams tend to have extra picks. They built in the margin for error. When you're short on picks, the biggest issue nobody talks about is you put your margin for error so ridiculously low that if you miss on a pick, and everybody eventually misses on a pick, you really set your franchise back. I think the Jets should be looking in the opposite direction this year. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast first, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.